the history of jazz in Pittsburgh. Really, it's a history of jazz in the country, and Pittsburgh is kind of a microcosm of that. Today, we're talking with a retired music educator from right here in Pennsylvania that is a co-author of a new book about the history of jazz in Pittsburgh. It's all on today's PMEA's Take Note podcast, presented by the Slippery Rock University Music Department. Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to this edition of Take Note. Really excited for today's episode. We're talking with a music educator from Pennsylvania, retired, who has written a book. And I'm so glad to have her here. She is a wonderful friend of mine that I've got to know over the past, I don't even know how many, 10, 15 years, I'd say. Karen Cole from the western side of the state. Karen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We'll get to the book and what it is in a second, but first, can you give us the thumbnail sketch of your career in music education?
Lifelong musician, learned the clarinet at 7 from local musicians here in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, and have been teaching music to other students and other people most of my life. I finished my career at McKeesport Area High School, had a fabulous experience there, taught marching band, wind ensemble, jazz band, had several small ensembles, and also taught world drumming there. So really enjoyed it. One of the classes I developed there was the history of jazz.
Which is a perfect segue. So I should say though, before we do the segue, I got to witness your teaching firsthand at McKeesport for many years. And I always would tell people, like, I want to be in Karen's band. Like, I want to go back and be in high school and be in her band, because, you're a taskmaster, but also, I watched your rehearsals. Those kids were having fun and they were determined. So my kudos to you on your career and the great the bands that you put out there. I mean, you did some really fantastic work in your education career. So my little shout out to you. But now that you're retired, you said, okay, I can't just be retired, right? I've got to do something further. So you came out and said, all right, I'm gonna write a book. So you're the co-author of this book, A History of Pittsburgh Jazz, Swinging in the Steel City. What a great book. What a great history lesson on jazz and so many other topics, actually, which we'll kind of get into. But so give us the kind of the overview here of where I guess I shouldn't say where you started with the idea of the book, because I know that changed over time. So just give us the thumbnail sketch of the book, I guess, is the best way to ask the question.
So a friend of mine who's a published author asked me to help him with this book. And the idea of the book was the history of Pittsburgh jazz. And he is I would call him an historian. And he wanted me to help with the music side because he doesn't know anything about music. And believe me, he doesn't. So we started with a basic outline of what we thought we were going to do. And that went in the garbage pretty quickly. As soon as we started to look at material, first of all, we realized there was going to be way more material than one book. One book would not tell the story. It's a very complex story. It's multifaceted. It includes politics, education, has some quite a bit of race relations, etc. So the first thing that we discovered was that in Pittsburgh, we had the perfect storm for jazz development. Because of the Great Migration at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, we had people coming from all over the world, Eastern Europeans, Italians, Irish, Germans, many Jews came here. We also had the Great Migration north from the southern states. So they brought all of their culture, their music, their food, their excuse me, their habits, their religion, all of the things that sort of blended together to help us develop jazz in the way that we see it today.
You know, the book kind of tells the story of how all of that kind of congregated here in this area. And, you know, I don't want to give too much of the book away, but I just love this story in there about how this riverboat that came to Pittsburgh really played such a huge impact in music in this area. And we don't have to go into that, but one of the things that really impacted the music scene over the years was music education, and how all of that culture, right, of music then was supported by what was happening in the Pittsburgh public school system.
Correct. So some of the other things in this perfect storm, we had the religious influence. We had the popularity of the piano in at that time everywhere, not just in Pittsburgh. The social mores were changing a little bit, of course, as we got into the 20th century. The riverboat influence came as riverboats brought cotton from the South and took products from the North to the South. And as part of that, they brought some of their music aboard ship. Eventually, that got shipped by rail. And when it got shipped by rail, then some of these big riverboat liners decided they would save their riverboats and redo them, retrofit them for entertainment. So Fate Marable was one of the people that came to Pittsburgh, up the Mississippi and across the Ohio and into Pittsburgh. So that, and he always had fabulous bands that played on stage and basically called out to people on shore to come and dance and enjoy the music. So that really did have a big influence. Fate Marable ended up being quite the character, which if you read the book, you'll read about him. But he liked Pittsburgh a lot, and he spent a lot of time here. His family was raised here. He was a fabulous musician. The person that owned that was the Streckfus liner, and Streckfus was a musician himself and a very hard taskmaster. So the quality of music was pretty high. The main thing I think, because I'm a music educator, that helped develop music in Pittsburgh was that the Pittsburgh public schools did buy in. They were the first public school system in Pennsylvania and the fifth in the nation to develop and implement music education. And it wasn't a superfluous curriculum. They didn't just sing some songs and whatnot. At Westinghouse, they required composition, transposition, tonal memory, note reading, etc. So it was a pretty hefty curriculum that was put into all of the public schools. And that happened in 1895, so quite a while ago. In 1869, in 1869, the music curriculum was extended to any Black school. So we had music ed curriculum in both schools, both Black schools and white schools, which really afforded students of every color to learn music.
Yeah, and you know, you detail in the book a lot of the names that have come out of those music programs, which I think when people read the book, they're going to say on so many things, not only just the ones that come out of music ed programs. Well, that person came through Pittsburgh. That person came through Pittsburgh. I didn't realize that. And you know, I mean, I've lived here all my life, and I found myself saying that as well. Let's jump to another big topic that you discuss in the book, and that it really is, you know, this is a history of jazz in Pittsburgh, but in a lot of ways, it's a history of race relations in Pittsburgh too. And one of the ways that that's really noted in the book is through the union cards, the musicians' union cards. Tell us a little bit about that.
The University of Pittsburgh has archives in Homewood, and we went there to look through these boxes. And one of the things we found there were the old union cards. Now, for those of you who don't know, there were two unions in Pittsburgh. There was a union made up of white musicians, and that was union number 60. And then there was a union made up of Black musicians, which was 471. And they operated separately for many, many years. And they operated the old way with large index cards that had their name at the top, and then when they paid their dues and what their gigs were and what they played, and then blah, blah, blah. So in 1965, when the courts said that the unions had to merge, so the Black Union and the White Union merged in Pittsburgh, which created a whole series of events that were in some ways very unfortunate for the African-American musicians. One of the things that happened was the union cards were inadvertently misplaced. So some of these musicians who had been working all their lives and had all of this information on these cards, they lost their benefits, they lost their tenure, they lost some of their sick pay, some of them were denied their death benefit. When we went through these boxes, of course, we found all these cards, and if you look at the book, you'll see we picked out some that of the better known musicians, Earl Gardner, Stanley Turrentine. And the cards are very telling because it tells how much they paid, if they were fined for something, how many gigs they had, what their start date was. And often there are notations on the cards which tell you other little details, which I found totally fascinating. So we copied some of them and had them in. One of the cards that's in the book is Art Nance, who of course is still living and still playing, which we kind of got a kick out of, and we went down and interviewed him. Yeah.
You know, so for folks who aren't familiar with Pittsburgh, a little bit of context. So the Hill District in Pittsburgh was kind of where the scene was, the jazz scene in Pittsburgh was. And that area was redeveloped at one point and really changed the whole dynamic of what the Hill was. And that also plays into that the race issues that you see, that you've explained, you know, that have played out with the union cards. There were, if you were a Black musician, you couldn't necessarily go from the Hill and into downtown and play at what would have been known as one of the white musician clubs. And even after the unions merged and the court said you have to merge, that was still an issue, right?
Correct. That was still an issue. So when we interviewed some of the musicians, it was an interesting thing. Most of the white musicians said, well, you know, the African Americans had their thing and we had our thing. But when you interviewed the Black musicians, it didn't sound like that. It sounded like they had been squeezed out.
Right. Right. So yeah, it's you know, we could probably go on for an hour just talking about that piece. I mean, it really is a fascinating look in this book, again, about that history of jazz, but of the race relations here and of the Hill District in Pittsburgh and how the clubs that were there and the community that was there evolved. So I would encourage people to look at it from that context as well. Okay, next topic, because there are so many topics in this book. Again, we could talk for hours. There are so many wonderful stories. Let's talk about Pittsburgh's connection to the Newport Jazz Festival.
In one of these boxes at the University of Pittsburgh archives was an old program from the Newport Jazz Festival in 1959. And as I was going through the box, some things I just put aside, but I thought, well, there must be a reason it's in this box. It must have some connection to Pittsburgh. So I opened up the centerfold of the program. And we actually took a picture of it and had it in the book. But in the 1959 Newport Jazz Festival, there were so many Pittsburghers it started to get funny. There was the Ahmad Jamal Trio, Roy Eldridge on trumpet, Dakota Staten was the featured vocalist, Ray Brown on bass. The headliner on Saturday was Earl Gardner, and the evening headliner was Duke Ellington, the Duke Ellington Band, which of course they were playing all of Billy Strayhorn's arrangements, a Pittsburgher. On Sunday, Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers were the headliners. So throughout this program, when we looked at it, it looked like it was mostly Pittsburghers. I was shocked by that. I've lived here my whole life. I knew these musicians came from Pittsburgh. I knew they had a Pittsburgh connection, but to be at that many Pittsburghers to be at that level at one time shocked me.
Right. You know, it kind of, yeah, you're right. I mean, when you look at that really kind of centralized, you know, decade or two-ish, yeah, it's incredible. And I love what you've done in this book here when you've referenced a few of the pictures. I was lucky enough to read the draft of this over a year ago, pre-COVID. And one of the things we had talked about at that time was, you've described this stuff, but I want to see the streets. I want to see the program. And that was a major piece of your research that you've done. And there are so many wonderful pictures in here that help contextualize the things that you're saying. So this was a pretty deep dive that you guys did.
Well, here's the thing. Anybody can look at, well, not the archive pictures, but the city of Pittsburgh has employed a city photographer or two or three or four since the beginning of time. And those are all online under Historic Pittsburgh. And I started to look at pictures at the very beginning of the research, thinking that would give me some context. And over the course of about 6 months, I think I looked at about 10,000 pictures. But the pictures often told a story that we weren't getting anywhere else. So when we narrowed down the pictures, we were very careful to have pictures that really related and relayed the story.
Right. Yeah. And you really have done a great job doing that. And I especially love, actually, I just opened the book and it goes right to the page on some of the union cards that we talked about, which is a really important context. Okay. So there's a great quote that you wanted to share from the book that I really think sums up what it was like in Pittsburgh, kind of at the heyday of jazz.
Well, many of the national musicians who played in Pittsburgh on their way between New York and Chicago, after hours went up into the Hill District to jam with our local musicians. And there was a story about Ahmad Jamal, who was a young player, younger, and he was playing at the Musicians Club, and Stan Getz and a couple other top name musicians came up and they were going to play with him. And they said they had a tune they wanted to play. And he asked them what key they wanted it in. And they said, oh, put it in your key. Well, he was a master at running through the key signatures, and he ran them through the key signatures. And I guess Getz got pretty frustrated, and he finally just ended up putting the horn away and going out the back door. And another musician who was there said, and the quote was, you have to be careful in Pittsburgh because a guy could jump off a garbage truck and play you off the stage. And I think that quote sums up the level of musicianship we had in Pittsburgh at that time, because the national people were afraid of somebody who might just walk in and play them off the stage.
Right. Yeah. I can't recommend the book enough, regardless of if you're from Pittsburgh or not. This is kind of a great piece of history here that talks about jazz, talks about Pittsburgh, and it's just how so many things converged. And you read this and it's like, oh, okay, that connects that dot, that connects that dot. And I know you're talking about maybe another book, because there's just so much information out there, more dots to connect, right?
Correct. Yeah, correct. I started a spreadsheet for the clubs and theaters at the time when we did book one, and I'm up to 134. So, and that would just be the central Pittsburgh area. That doesn't get out to McKeesport,
suburbs, and yeah.
Suburbs. So we figured out very early on that we had to draw a pretty close radius around the point to keep the book clean, I guess, in terms of the material, because there's so much material.
We're talking about the clubs. There's so much I loved about the book, but I love these stories out of the clubs. And really, it got that feel of how music was such a huge part of the culture. Live music was a huge part of the culture. And going to clubs to see music was, and that's not, we don't live in that time now.
Well, it was estimated, we saw something that said it was estimated that in the heyday, 35,000 people a day saw live music.
Wow.
A day.
Wow.
But like at Westview, they had a dance floor that was, an acre big. Sure. So that would be considered, and they had a live dance band there. So
right. Well, the book again, a history of, if I can get it right on the screen, a history of Pittsburgh jazz, swinging in the Steel City. Karen Cole, former music educator. I guess I shouldn't say former, because you're always educating. Retired music educator. Thank you so much for being here and sharing a little bit about the book. Really appreciate it.
Again, thank you for having me.
And thanks to all of you for joining us on PMEA's Take Note podcast presented by the Slippery Rock University Music Department. We also want to thank our sponsors, the Bucknell University Music Department, Lebanon Valley College, and Robert M. Sides Family Music Center. We'll see you next time.